Hello, my name is Trevor Dame. Most people probably know me from two things. They know me from either Through the Years, that's THROH for the spelling of through, because it is a podcast about the history of classic Ring of Honor, or you just might know me as the guy who says a lot of dumb things on Twitter at Trevor Dame. Those are the two main things, but before I did either of those things, the thing that people probably knew me for was related to TNA, and it's kind of embarrassing. You see, there used to be a thread, well, actually a series of threads on the Figure 4 Wrestling Observer message board about a couple different TNA message boards, and pretty wild message boards. So these started well before I ever saw these threads, but I kind of came in and latched onto these threads, which were basically people would read these TNA message boards. They would find kind of like the wildest posts. They would like quote them in this thread, and then everyone would talk about them and joke about them. And I ended up getting sucked into these threads way long after they happened, to the point where I ended up posting in them every day, where I would basically almost do like a column every day where I would take kind of the wildest posts from those forums, mostly one of them, and I would try and correct certain errors and do it in a funny way, and all sorts of crazy things happened. People in the thread ended up figuring out that one of the people that ran one of those sites faked their death. All sorts of weird things happened. It's a long story. It's crazy, but that was the thing I used to be known for, and I wasted too much of my life on it. So when I got asked to contribute to this fine podcast and this fine episode, I guess the temptation would be to talk about that stuff, but honestly, I know those fans are not indicative of all TNA fans, just like how you can go to any fandom of any company, any site, any place ever, and you can find corners of the internet with really militant fans. And so TNA was no better or worse, I would say, in that respect. But I do think I learned some things about TNA from studying those fans for way too long and writing about TNA for way too long. So when Garrett asked me to talk about this, I thought, well, how can I count what's my original take on TNA when probably so many people are going to be contributing things? How have my weird experience informed something? And I do think I've come up with a take. So one complaint you would see often on these TNA message boards, the couple we went to, again, there was probably some great ones out there, but the ones we focused on, they were very militant. In fact, one of them broke off from the first one because even though the first one was pretty relentlessly positive, some people that used to write for that site thought it was not positive enough, and they formed another site. And that's actually, I'll just say that name of that site, it was TNA Mecca. It actually ended up having a little bit of influence on TNA in the sense of they did interviews with top TNA stars. TNA employee Bob Ryder would frequently lurk on that site and sometimes post and even do Q&As just randomly on the site. And the most common refrain you would see from that site and sites like that would be this very angry, paranoid, it's us against the world feeling. There was this thought that everybody from non-TNA fans to the wrestling media to wrestlers that weren't in TNA, they all, quote-unquote, wanted TNA to fail. And a lot of times these people that were saying this couldn't even tell you why these people wanted TNA to fail, but there was this feeling that they were not being honest, that really deep down they would like TNA, but they wanted TNA to fail, so they were saying things they didn't mean, and there was just this feeling that they desperately did not want this kind to succeed. And see, I actually think the opposite is true. I think people desperately wanted TNA to succeed, and that is why, even though I think a lot of the criticism TNA got was fair, if it ever got some that was extra harsh or extra passionate, maybe sometimes harsher than it deserved or more passionate than you would expect, more passionate than other companies would receive, I think it's because so many people wanted that company to succeed in the worst way. And I think why is because TNA was basically the Rorschach test, in my opinion, of professional wrestling companies. Everybody looked at TNA and they wanted it to be what they wanted a wrestling company to be. And I guess you could argue that's how people look at everything, but I think it was different for TNA because you have to remember, I think what carves TNA's special place in wrestling history was it was the first company after WWE gained a full monopoly, after ECW went out of business and after WCW went out of business. It was the first wrestling company in the US after that happened that actually had a shot of competing on a national stage. It eventually got onto a major cable channel. It had pretty good ratings at its peak. I mean, ratings that obviously in today's more decreased TV market people would kill for, at least in total audience. It had at some times a big budget. Millions and millions of dollars were sunk into TNA. It had top talent behind the scenes and in front of the camera. It had a ton of resources. It was the one company before AEW that had an actual shot. And I think because of that, everyone wanted TNA to succeed because they didn't want wrestling to be a monopoly. Because we've seen for most of the last 20 years, when wrestling on a national stage is a monopoly, it kind of gets boring for a variety of reasons, and the product that has the monopoly kind of suffers. And so if you look at TNA, I think so many people, they needed TNA to succeed. It was almost like, there's so many wrestling companies, not to be mean to them, but if they're bad, people don't get passionate that they're bad because it's like, well, I didn't expect much for them to begin with, and I already have my options. Like, not to pick on these companies, but in today's wrestling landscape where we have so many options, and there are seemingly two major companies in the U.S. right now, and it's so much easier to access small options. Like, I don't see a lot of hatred when MLW or NWA run a bad show. And some people would say, probably some of those people on those old TNA message boards would say, see, that's proof. People are going easy on those companies, and they were so much harder on TNA back in the day because they had a vendetta against TNA. And I think the truth is, no one expects anything from MLW or NWA. So they're not disappointed, and no one badly needs those companies to succeed. I'm sure we would all like them to succeed, but we don't badly need them to succeed the way so many of us really felt like we needed TNA to succeed in those early years when WWE controlled everything. And I think if you look at TNA's history, it's really sad that so often it's the fans, the journalists, and even the wrestlers and the people behind the scenes. Like, I felt like TNA never really got to establish a consistent identity over the long term because everybody was kind of like criticizing it or trying to steer it to what they wanted wrestling to be. And it was usually something that wrestling already had been. So, there was definitely a fan base of people. And I definitely saw this looking at the TNA forums of people that just wanted TNA to be WCW. There was a lot of fans on those forums that they were wrestling fans that would say, that they never watched WWF, they hated it for a variety of reasons, some good, some bad, and they were huge WCW fans, and TNA was literally the only thing keeping them as wrestling fans. They would often say, if TNA goes out of business, I'm done watching wrestling. So a lot of them wanted TNA to be WCW. And then there was the hardcore Vince Russo fans. So the various times Vince Russo got in power, there were some of those fans that would be like, any ills with this company is because Vince Russo isn't being given enough control. The reins are, we need to get back to Crash TV because that's when wrestling was the most popular. That's, what wrestling needs to be, and Vince Russo in TNA is our only shot. And then, when Ring of Honor and the Super Indies kind of rose up, there were a lot of people that wanted TNA to be that. Obviously, you had elements of that in the X Division, but it got to the point where I know TNA, some people behind the scenes, resented how many times in like the wrestling newsletters and on message boards, fans would say things like, oh, these guys are good, but they're better in TNA. I mean, sometimes even some of the wrestlers like AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels, for a brief period, would even say things like, oh, I have more fun in Ring of Honor. And I know that bothered people in TNA. And again, it's just another direction people wanted that company to go in. And then, of course, there was a lot of people trying to just relive wrestling history where they would sign every old star, that was available, eventually walked through TNA's doors, whether or not they were the right fit or, maybe financially worth it at that point in their careers. Because again, it was a lot of people thought, let's just relive the heyday. And looking back on it, I feel bad about that. I feel like TNA was a kid that got raised by a whole lot of parents, And those parents never really let that kid find its own identity. And that's the tragedy, because TNA had so much talent and had at different times the resources, like I said earlier. And there are some really good things that I think with TNA that have gone underappreciated because people just were disappointed with what they wanted it to be that it wasn't, instead of looking at what it actually was, even if it was at times far from perfect. What I would say, this is my way of telling those fans for all those years ago. I wish I could go back in time machine and tell those fans, although I never really interacted with them very much personally. I left them alone. But I guess what I would say is, you kind of want people to be that angry about your company, because if they're that angry, that means they're that passionate. And if people are that passionate, it means they care. People were that passionate about TNA in a way they weren't about other wrestling promotions, because they wanted it to succeed, because they needed it to succeed. In fact, I remember sometimes on those TNA forums, sometimes even when there was a show so bad that even those fans, the most militant, relentlessly enforced positivity type fans, I remember sometimes some of them, believe it or not, would even say, like, you should watch this show anyway, because if you don't, WWE wins. Like, watch the show, buy this pay-per-view that wasn't good, because, we need this kind to succeed. Just the idea of it, we need it to succeed. Yeah, I feel that's why I feel like this podcast, you guys are doing the Lord's work, because, like I mentioned earlier, I do a podcast about Ring of Honor. I think it's a good podcast. I think it's a lot of fun. I think you learn about a lot of the greatest wrestlers of the last 20 years, and you learn a lot about the history of like modern independent wrestling as a whole, not just Ring of Honor. But I feel like when we covered that show, because that company was that pretty beloved, if not super popular, was critically beloved. Like, a lot of times we don't uncover a ton of hidden gems. Like, guess what? We say Samoa Joe versus Kento Kobashi was great. That's not a shock. People knew that. People said the CM Punk versus Samoa Joe hour-long matches were great. Guess what? Like, that's not a shock. But I feel like there are so many matches in TNA and little moments and little runs, probably of a month here, a couple months there, that were really good. And because people were just so disappointed by either what was going on the top of the card, or because it wasn't fitting their idea of what wrestling needed, that they just hand waved it away and were really disappointed. Like, it reminds me of AJ Styles. I did an article a while ago for my Patreon, which I will plug at the end. I will save you all. But I did an article where I was kind of researching the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame that a lot of people, like the luminaries of wrestling, can vote on, and the Hall of Fame. And if you look at like the vote totals of certain guys like AJ Styles, there's a guy who fell off the ballot when he was in TNA, worked most of his career in TNA, put in a ton of great work, spent most of his career there. And then he spends a couple years in New Japan and on the Indies, and 1 year in WWE, and he's in the Hall of Fame. And his numbers went from, in the Observer, you have to get over, I forget if it's 50 or 60%. My memory is so bad. And I should know that because I am now a voter in it recently. But he went from being under 10% to at least half or more of the vote. I think that tells you how easy it was for people to ignore great work in TNA, because there was a shit ton of great AJ Styles matches in TNA, more probably in that promotion to this day than any other promotion, even though it's now he's been many years removed from it. And so to me, when I think of TNA, it's the Rorschach test of professional wrestling. Everyone wanted it to be what they wanted wrestling from it. They were intensely passionate about it because it was the company that everyone needed to succeed. And it's the company that probably is going to have more hidden gems and little moments that fall under the radar of any company of its size in modern wrestling history. So guys, you guys are doing a great job covering it. Thank you for covering it. Thank you for letting me ramble for a few minutes. I was honored to be asked. And again, so if you want to hear me ramble about things that aren't TNA, again, we have the Through the Years podcast, my Twitter, and I also have a Patreon, which covers nothing almost. Well, it does have miscellaneous articles for me, but it covers mostly just my coverage of these crazy TNA message boards, which I stopped many years ago. Well, a couple years ago. But basically, it's everything I ever did on those things. It's $5 a month. You get the entire archives, plus a lot of miscellaneous wrestling articles and reviews. That would be patreon.com/ Mecca Mecca. So that's MECCA, twice in a row, no spaces. And I will leave you with one anecdote that maybe tells you how special TNA and those message boards really were. This is the weirdest thing that ever happened in all my years following these message boards. So there would be a lot of colorful characters we got to know following these message boards. There was one, I won't name them even, I don't want to embarrass them, but they were very into TNA. They lived with their mother even though they were well into their late 30s, early 40s, and they were militantly into TNA. They didn't always seem to have a good relationship with their mother. They would vent on that in the forum. So one day he was live chatting on the forum during Impact, as people would on that forum or other forums, and he just started to update people that his mother was lying on the couch unresponsive, and he wasn't sure if she was alive or dead. And he began to give live updates on that and say, like, okay, my brother's calling an ambulance. Medics are here. They think she's maybe fallen into like a diabetic coma. I'm going to stay at the home, but my brother's going with her in the ambulance. And interspersed with these, the darkest, most frightening comments you would want to read from anybody, he was continuing to recap that episode of Impact. So it would be, you would just look at the feed, and it would be like, you would see a post from him going, okay, I think she's breathing, but she's still not responsive. And then like 4 minutes later, he would be like, that's a great match from Frankie Kazarian. And the temptation would be to say this was all fake. I saw years of this guy posting. He never said anything weird like this before or after. He didn't have any wild stories or anything crazy. If anything, the things he would reveal about his personal life would be things that seemed very honest, because they were things you wouldn't generally want to disclose. They didn't reflect well on him. His mother turned out to be okay, by the way, at least at that moment. But in a way, when I think of TNA, of all the other things I mentioned, maybe that's the thing I think about, because for anything you can say about TNA, bad or good, it is the only wrestling promotion I have ever seen that inspired devotion to the level that a fan would live recap the show. He wouldn't tear away from his mother's possible death/coma. He still had to keep watching that Impact. And quite frankly, I've never seen another promotion do something like that. So have a great anniversary, TNA.